I mentioned in the introduction, my focus is really on security. So I'm deeply interested in issues to do with the environment and climate change, which I think are pressing issues, but I come at this as a scholar of security and the military. And so you'll get a sense of that from my presentation. And I hope to learn from you all about some of the aspects around climate change and even securitization and militarization that I may have overlooked or not be as familiar with. So I have, I hope, about 30 minutes to present, and then hopefully we'll have a great conversation afterwards. So I'll just run through my slides. So as a geographer, this is very common in our field that we present a lot of images and PowerPoint slides, but hopefully keeps you focused on things as we move along. So just to begin, militaries are a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. There's been a recent study listed at the bottom of the screen here by the Conflict and Environment Observatory and Scientists for Global Responsibility that just came out a few weeks ago, indicating that by their calculations, militaries around the world are the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And that is that they're responsible for about 5.5% overall. Now, the big problem here is that governments are not required to report the amount of greenhouse gases that they emit. Some do so voluntarily. The Paris Agreement from 2015 encouraged states to do so, but many don't. So it's really hard to get this calculation. So the report is very helpful, and it goes through the math that they've used to get to this number. It's maybe not entirely accurate. They don't actually count warfare as part of this. It's mostly about operations. So there's still big gaps in the kinds of ways that we're making these calculations, but people are starting to try and account for the great amount of greenhouse gas emissions that militaries contribute. Netta C. Crawford has recently published a book on the image on the right, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, that goes into more detail on the US, what the Pentagon is emitting. And as she and others have said, that as an institution, the US military is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. It's responsible for about 80 to 90% of federal government emissions in the United States. And as the world's largest military, bigger than the next 10 militaries combined, it is indeed very responsible. So all of this is to say that militaries have a huge role to play in thinking about greenhouse gases and contribution to climate change. And if you look at any of their vehicles, you can understand why this may be the case, just looking at the miles per gallon that they get, whether it's a Stryker vehicle or an HMMWV or a US Marine MRAP, the mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles. So you can see they're not very good in terms of the miles per gallon. And of course, if we look at some of the aircraft, or if we were to look at ships, I can only give some examples here, but you can see there's obviously, just in terms of the amount of oil that they use, a huge amount in terms of this kind of equipment that the military is using. And then we can also look at the impact of war and how that also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is an older study that was looking particularly at the role of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions during the early stages of the Iraq War. So these calculations are from March 2003 to December 2007. And Stephen Kretzman from Oil Change International estimated that at that time, just in that less than 4-year period, the US military operations were ranked, if they were ranked as a country in terms of emissions, they would be emitting more CO2 each year than 139 of the world's nations do annually. So it's not just the normal operations that we need to account for, but also warfare, which is also hard to put a number value on, but people are trying to do so to draw attention to these very issues. And if we look at forward operating bases, oil is a huge part of how the military operates, whether it's the United States, if it's Canada and Afghanistan, or other countries on the ground. In fact, back in 2011, US General David Petraeus said energy is the lifeblood of our warfighting capabilities. And so really it is seen to be crucial to the ways that military do their business. And yet at the same time, even as Petraeus was making such a comment, it was also clear to many that oil was also a real problem for the military because of the ways these convoys, as you can see here in the picture on the left, could very easily be targeted for attack. So trying to get your oil to these forward operating bases not only was difficult because you had to cross borders or you had to transport the oil internationally, but then the long convoys such as these that were conveying oil were also very easy targets on the field. And so it has also been said by other generals, like the U.S. Marine Corps General Jim Mattis, before he was in charge of defense under Trump, that we needed to unleash from the tether of fuel. That was his words about the U.S. military, because of the kinds of attacks that were happening on these oil convoys. So in terms of their own military operations, for their own military objectives, it was becoming clear to the US military that something had to change in terms of the need for oil that they had on the ground. It has also become clear to militaries such as the United States, and many of these examples will come from the US. Again, it's the largest military in the world by far. But the US has also been coming to terms with how climate change is impacting on its bases and operations within the United States. So climate change related events like Hurricane Michael were responsible for this catastrophic damage at the Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama, Florida. So that's on the Panhandle in Florida. So you can see some of the impact there. So the military is very aware that these bases, many of which are on the seas, have been very vulnerable to climate change impacts, and even inland as well. So this is an image from Nebraska, where we have the Offutt Air Base being flooded out. About a third of it was underwater because of the overflow from a river, again attributed to climate change. So this kind of impact at home has also really started to impact on the military's thinking around its need to address aspects to do with climate change. And of course, there's also the ways that climate change has been seen to be responsible, if only one of many factors, for conflict that's happening around the world. So even back in 2007, we had Ban Ki-moon stating that one of the contributing factors for the conflict in Darfur was to do with ecological crisis, arising in part from climate change. One of the problems here is that it's very difficult to identify climate change as a single kind of factor that leads to civil unrest or other kinds of conflict, but many people are absolutely identifying the role that climate change has in contributing or even being the instigating factor around the kinds of challenges that we find in many parts of the world, for reasons to do with reduction in access to resources, needs, for farming or for water and so on. And so this relationship between conflict and climate change has also become much more accepted. Here's another example of a map here where Ewald Wiseman, who's an academic and an architect based in the UK, but has his roots in Israel, has been tracing some of the correlations between climate change and the impact on the ground. So Naomi Klein has also picked up on this in some of her work, and looking at the way as this map shows that the locations of many of the Western drone attacks in Northern Africa and the Middle East also coincide with the aridity line. And as that aridity line has shifted because of climate change and many more places are in drought, we see civil conflict arising, but also US and Western intervention in precisely those places. So the point is that this is not a coincidence, that these things are happening in hand with one another. And bringing it closer to home, we also see the way that this is contributing to changing understandings of the Arctic. So I could go into this in much greater detail, and maybe we can in the discussion, but there are lots of territorial claims in the Arctic, and there are also conflicts around those territorial claims, including between Canada and the United States, Canada and Russia and other countries as well. So Russia in particular has been really reorienting its military to its Arctic region. Canada did so as well under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. That's faded a little bit, but we still have every year summer operations like Operation Nanook that go into the Canadian Arctic to reassert our sovereignty in that region. And part of the reason for that are the changes to do with climate change, because of the impact it's having on increased access for boats. So you can have more tourism, and there have been tourist boats that have gone up there. There's been more access for around the year trade through the Northwest Passage, for example. There's also been potential for more oil exploration in the Arctic region, which has led to more military buildup, most particularly in Russia. So here's an example of Russia's Trefoil Air Base, which is its most northerly military base, which actually dates back to the 1950s. But back then it was just a radar station with a small runway. It's now been upgraded in the last couple of years with a couple more runways. You can see from the images here, these runways are capable of carrying some of the largest planes and other military vehicles. And they now have a 24/7 presence in the Arctic and have really shifted a lot of their attention to protecting their own northern passageway, which they claim as their own sovereign territory or maritime waters, as does Canada with the Northwest Passage. And notably, the United States disagrees with both countries that we have territorial sovereignty over those areas. So there's a lot of potential for conflict to erupt in these regions. We have NATO operations happening in the region in light of this, which could also increase tension. So there's a lot of ways that climate change is leading to different kinds of potential conflict scenarios like this in the Arctic, as well as the ways that militaries in places such as Canada are retooling so they can do more kind of humanitarian style response when there are climate change impacts at home. So this is just a mild example here of Canadian soldiers trying to push back some of the waters on the overflowing Ottawa River, but another example of how the military sees itself as responding both internationally and domestically to some of the changes that are unfolding as a result of climate change. It's therefore not surprising, I think now knowing all of this, that militaries are turning to look at climate change more explicitly. And I first came across this when I was living for a year in Australia, and just as we were getting close to coming back to Canada, but I was very interested when Kevin Rudd, who is then Prime Minister, announced this event here. As you can see, the release of a defense white paper in which climate change was identified as a security threat. And for me, that was the first time that I had heard that link being made, and I had heard that link being made by a military. And I was particularly interested in this case because they had a special interest in what they saw as the potential for climate refugees coming from the South Pacific and potentially coming to Australia because those islands were becoming inundated with water. So that was one of the big focuses of this defense white paper. They were also interested in changes to fishing grounds in the region in Australia and the potential for conflict there. But this for me was the first time that I came across this kind of linkage that was, the militaries taking this kind of interest. And when I came back to Canada and started to look into this a bit more, and this is where my interest in this started to form, I found out that Canada too was making those kinds of connections. So in January of 2009, we had a national defense report that was identifying the environment as a future site of security concerns. The following year, the Pentagon released its own quadrennial defense review, and it was the first time that they identified climate change as a military threat. And they even posited then that energy efficiency would be a force multiplier. So already back in 2010, the Pentagon was thinking about being more energy efficient as a way of being better on the battlefield, which is something that I'll pick up a bit more as we go. And then in February of that year as well, the UK Ministry of Defence also issued its own climate change strategy. Now, there had been some previous kinds of statements and there was some recognition about climate change, but I think this was really the constellation in the years 2009, 2010 that these things really started to come together. And since then, it has only increased in terms of how militaries around the world are taking up these kinds of issues. So in September of last year, the Department of Defense issued its own climate adaptation plan. And as they stay in the forward of this document, around the world, climate change is a destabilizing force. demanding new missions of us and altering the operational environment. At the same time, climate-related extreme weather affects military readiness and drains our resources. So really making a clear statement as to both the future of potential conflict, but also the impact on military operations as well. So that fulsome dynamic is being identified here. And then if we look even more recently to this year, to February, we have the United States Army issuing its climate strategy. Now, none of these documents are really full of grades of research or information, but they certainly do contain some nuggets around their climate strategy. So the 3 goals that they set out to proactively consider the security implications of climate change with respect to strategy, planning, acquisition, supply chain, and programming documents and processes, and also their other goals of achieving 50% reduction in Army net greenhouse gases by 2030 compared to 2005 levels, and then attaining net zero Army greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And those 2 last measures have been taken up by other militaries as well. So this seems to be the challenge that militaries have on the table, about 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So they do have some tangible goals that they have set, even though these documents are quite short on detail. So this Army climate strategy document is only about 20 pages, and it's a very quick read because there's not a lot of content there. You would not go to these documents to really get a clear sense of the changes that are anticipated. But there are ways that the military has taken up this challenge and is trying to innovate. As I mentioned, oil for forward operating bases is seen as a big problem for the military because of the threat it puts them under. So we do have innovations like this one with solar panels being implemented, in this case in Helmand province in Afghanistan, as a way to try and reduce the demand of the soldiers on the ground for the need for oil, or even for batteries is another issue because of the amount of equipment that soldiers carry these days is so reliant on having some kind of energy source that that's also seen as a threat and a challenge to the soldiers who are operating in the field. There's other kinds of more cool kinds of technologies that are being innovated and trialed in the field. So these kinds of tents that have portable, flexible, and lightweight solar-powered shades are really becoming quite the norm, whether they're in kind of more green landscapes on the left or desert landscapes like they're in Djibouti in Africa, which is the only African state that the US has a military base. And this is one where they have these solar-powered panels that they are using to try and reduce their need for oil and other horrible energy sources that they're using. These are examples of some of the new kinds of ways that they're trying to design the soldier themselves to be more energy efficient. So solar powered helmets, like you can see on the right, other kinds of ways that they might use the textiles themselves to be energy generators. They have these kinetic energy harvesting things you can see on the left that look a little bit like a leg brace, but this would be a soldier on patrol that would generate their own energy while they were in the field and thus reduce the reliance either on oil or battery power. So all of these solar harvesting backpacks that they've designed. So they're really trying to think through these different technologies to reduce the amount of oil that they have and other energy sources. And this is another example here of a solar-powered water purification system. And so I use this example here because there are ways that some of the technologies that the military is innovating could have longer-term and better use on the ground. So this is an installation that potentially could be permanent, but could be left in the community that would have a longer-term impact and not only be for military use when it's there. So there are some ways that they're thinking creatively about some of these kinds of innovations. I will come back with some caveats about that in a few minutes, but it is important to see the kind of the breadth of technologies that are being innovated, and including the installation of solar power at many bases across the United States. So this is just one example at the Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. There's over a dozen, I believe now, Air Force bases with these kinds of extensive solar powered fields. And partly it's because military bases have very extensive land that they have open to them where they can put some installations like this into place. Obama was very much in support of this kind of retooling of the bases, part of his green initiatives that he touted, maybe less effectively than we would like, but he did have the rhetoric anyway about having kind of more green machine in the United States, including ways that he was trying to bring vets who had been involved in the war on terror into the green economy. So he even had a project that he was channeling people who had been in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular and bringing them back to the US and training them up so that they could be part of this new green economy that he was proposing. But these kinds of innovations have also taken on different kinds of shifts. So this is the first floating solar array that is now in place in Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which is the US military's largest base in the United States, perhaps even the largest populated military base in the world. So here they're innovating with some water, or these floating solar panels on the water, again, trying to reduce their domestic use within the United States in terms of their reliance. So this idea of energy independence and energy efficiency has very much pushed some of these kinds of initiatives that the military has taken up, including the ways that they are powering their vehicles. So this is the GE F-14 Green Hornet, which is now powered by 50% biofuel, which they're deriving from all kinds of different sources, including pond scum, grass clippings, old t-shirts, and they're seeing this as a way, again, to reduce the reliance on conventional oil. Or they've also looked to electrify their vehicles. So these are non-operational vehicles. They realize that this is probably impractical in the field of battle to need to plug in your tank, but they have turned their fleet in the United States over to these electric vehicles, and it probably is one of the largest electric vehicle powered fleets within the United States. So they are using this new technology and contributing to some of the research and development on this kind of technology. And as we can see from this quote that I've included here by Oshkosh Defense, which is one of the biggest military companies within or it's not maybe the top of the companies, but it's one of the key ones in the United States. Not Oshkosh that makes the overalls, but it's a different company. They create vehicles such as these. And as they are very proud to say that the silent drive that these electrical vehicles mean that they won't, the enemy won't hear them coming. I mean, this is a little bit of a farcical statement because they are not using them in battle operations, but it just shows how they're trying to think through the implementation of these kinds of new sources of energy for these vehicles. But this brings me to some of my concerns. And so as much as I think, if the militaries are going to be such big, they are in fact such big contributors to greenhouse gases, it's really important that they start to address that. I have real problems with some of the ways that the military is really inserting itself in the space around climate change, innovation, and the importance that they are putting onto climate change. And I'm going to now talk about some of those concerns. One of them is the military is really trying to position itself, especially in the United States, as a key player in climate change innovation. And that means that they are the ones who want to be seen as the drivers for new kinds of technologies and new developments in terms of thinking about more, better vehicles, as this quote is showing here. So electronic vehicles, working with leading contractors like the GM's defense unit, but also the way that the military becomes the funnel through which that funding is allocated. So that industrial military pipeline is being reinforced by the military's turn to climate change. And I feel that that's a really troubling aspect of what's going on, particularly in the United States. So the military is using this to actually up their budget, which in the United States is already unbelievable at over $780 billion a year annually. But using this kind of innovation, this kind of partnership with private companies as a rationale for increasing the amount of money that goes to the Department of Defense. And I think that that's a real problem with what's going on here. There are ways that they are inserting themselves in the research and development, both in terms of the private sector, but also angling into universities, and that research and development, I think, is a real problem. And this is just one example of how that is taking place. It's a problem not only because it actually reinforces the role of the military in the United States, but it also drives the kind of technologies that will be developed. So this emphasis on kind of private vehicles that the military would use, SUV style vehicles, means that that's where the research and development money is going to go, not on things like public transit, because obviously the military has no interest in public transit whatsoever, or thinking around those kinds of things that we might need, but thinking about their own kinds of toys that they need on the field, and then potentially the ways that those could be taken up in the civilian domain. So I think all of this is actually really worrying. As much as I think, the militaries need to reduce their greenhouse gases, I think this kind of partnership with industry, with the private sector, with the universities is really, really troubling. And in fact is really just kind of papering over or glossing over some of the structural problems, which are to do with the kinds of ways that we have designed our societies around capitalism and around consumption, right? And so this kind of way of thinking about innovation through private sector is really just glossing over some of the structural problems. And in fact, as I said before, reinforcing the role of military within society. This extends to the ways that some of their environmental initiatives are also always imagined in terms of their capacity for killing. So this is an example of how the military shifted over to copper bullets away from lead bullets, which is less about climate change, but it speaks to my point about how their interest in thinking more environmentally, so moving away from lead and to copper, is still structured through their own interest in being a killing machine. So that's what the military is all about, and that's what they want to do better. So it's only because copper, even though it's a lighter substance, can be turned into a bullet that is as effectively lethal as lead, that the military is interested in this kind of environmental innovation and design. And so again, we have to keep that in mind as we're looking to what the military is doing and being very mindful of the fact that that is their bottom line. They are interested in being a war machine and a killing machine. And that is a big problem if those are the kinds of people who are directing some of the changes that we need to have happen with respect to climate change. And in fact, this is stated very clearly in the Army's climate strategy, where they say upfront that the Army's core purpose remains unchanged. It's to deploy, fight, and win the nation's wars by providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance as part of the joint force. Climate change will only make this mission more challenging, and the Army must proactively reduce the risk that climate change imposes. And here too, that this idea that climate change is going to only exacerbate the kinds of conflict that we see in the future, which it may well do, but this idea only further legitimates the need for a military that is able to respond, as much as it is also trying to be proactive to try and think about reducing its own greenhouse gas emissions. It also reinforces an idea, which I think is very prevalent, that all crises, like the ones that are brought about by climate change, lead to conflict. And I agree that conflict is one possible scenario, but it overlooks the ways that crisis can also lead to cooperation and collaboration. And in fact, we've seen this during the pandemic, which was a crisis, that we see as many examples of terrible things happening. We also see lots of people offering fulsome support to one another, working collaboratively, thinking about one another. And unfortunately, the military inserting itself in this space encourages an idea about conflict, about people fighting, rather than thinking about how crisis might be used and harnessed, in fact, to think more about collaboration and cooperation. The military also is very much about security and not being very transparent about what it's doing. And I think that's a really difficult model to adopt in thinking about climate change, which again relies on cooperation with countries around the world and across public and private sector. So this kind of model of secrecy, of not allowing people in, of black boxing, whether it's research and development or the kinds of technologies that they are innovating, I think is also deeply troubling because of the ways that the military is stepping in to this space. There's also the concern that militaries are all about hierarchy and about discipline, and they're not about bottom-up solutions. They're about being told what to do by your superiors and enacting those kinds of commands. And I think, again, as a model for addressing climate change, this is deeply troubling as militaries, again, really try and insert themselves into the climate change discussions and really trying to take some control over the direction that these conversations unfold. And so I'm bringing us close to the end here. I just have a few more slides, but that talk about, the problems around military greenwashing, but bring it up a little bit into the present. So my main takeaway right now is, yes, militaries do need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but in doing so, they're actually reinforcing their own, their perceived need on the ground, and in fact, redirecting more resources to the military, which I don't think is part of the solution that we need to be looking towards as we move forward. And so just a few comments about some recent COP meetings. So back in Glasgow last year, the COP26 meetings, it was the first time that the NATO representative was there taking the floor. That's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who you can see on the top right there, who also attended, although virtually, at the COP27 in Egypt. But this was an important moment where NATO was stepping in and saying, okay, we have a role to play in thinking about climate change. And indeed, this year in the summer, they also put out their own climate change and security impact assessment, which has some goals very similar to the US military's goals. So they too are taking up these issues around climate change, as saying that they really need to address these issues. In this case with NATO, even though they're thinking about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, they very much are emphasizing climate change as a crisis multiplier. So this idea of crisis, of ongoing crisis, future crisis, more resources for militaries, more resources for NATO is very much part of the framework that they are projecting. We also have other advisory councils on climate change, which bring together military and former military with other researchers and so on. Now, I don't think that these are necessarily horrible organizations. I think there's probably some good that can come of them, just as I think that there's some good that can come of the military's reducing greenhouse gases. But I do think the rising number of these kinds of advisory groups that really do foreground the military, perhaps the International Military Council on Climate and Security foremost, I think are, again, really problematic in the proliferation of militaries in thinking about these kinds of issues. And again, the emphasis that is placed on crisis and conflict, and hence on the need for the military. And in Canada, for those of us are watching from Canada, we, I think, need to be very mindful, because in June of this year, the Madrid conference, the NATO Madrid conference, we had Trudeau on the stage announcing that there will be a new climate change and security center for excellence, and it will be located in Montreal. And this center, again, may well do some great work. I don't doubt it. I think all of these things are complicated. There's good and bad that come out of them. I think that this is maybe a good initiative. We'll see. It's very early days, but it's very clear from the get-go that the intent of this center is to be a platform for military actors and civilians to develop, enhance, and share knowledge on climate change security impacts. So again, the military is very much a central actor in terms of thinking about how this will unfold, given the military importance in terms of the kinds of money that are going to the military these days. I am a little concerned that the militaries are such a key part of these kinds of conversations, and that the discussions and the initiatives will be railroaded to their agenda. Now, having said all of this very critical stuff, I think, about what's going on, I should also note that since the time when I first started looking into these things back in 2008 and 2009, that there has been a lot more activism that is making the links between militarism and climate change. And so those are just a few examples of some different campaigns that are underway. You can see the brochures that are there, but also the people in the street carrying signs that are making these very explicit connections between the ways that militaries are contributing to climate crisis and the need for militaries to decarbonize. And in fact, and this is my last slide, we had at COP27 Code Pink making this argument. In their case, they were very specifically looking at militaries reporting on the emissions that they are generating, because that is one small step to draw attention to this, but also to push militaries to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. So I'm not saying that this was necessarily hugely impactful. I don't know that any resolution has come out of COP27, but I do think it's really important that these kinds of links are being made, that there are these activists who are taking up the call to make the links between militaries and climate change, and to argue both for decarbonization and demilitarization. So it's not about making militaries more resilient and better able to adapt to climate change, but it's looking at a way of addressing climate change by de-emphasizing militaries and reducing their power. And I think that's really where we need to go, is not buttressing militaries by allowing them to take up the agenda that is kind of greenwashed and seen to be more humanitarian by turning to address climate issues, but actually working towards decarbonization and demilitarization hand in hand. So I will leave it at that. I've taken a little bit more time than I thought I would, but I hope there's still plenty of time for discussion and conversation. So thank you.